Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. There's no doubt about the benefits of globalization, and China has been one of the biggest beneficiaries of this process. But right now, some politicians and experts are arguing that globalization has only made things worse. Inequalities, for example, have grown since the 1970s and become more marked with the globalization drive that hits certain parts of the population, notably within high-income economies. What has been really going on in the past few decades? Has the tide of globalization gone into reverse? What better policy moves do we need to map out the future of globalization? To discuss these issues and more, I'm very happy to be joined in the first part of the program by Professor Wang Hui with the Tsinghua University. When we come back in the second half, I'll be very glad to talk to Professor Wang Gengwu, Chairman of the East Asian Institute of the National University of Singapore. Before we get started, let's look at this.
Now a professor in the Department of Chinese Language and Literature at Tsinghua University, Wang Hui was the executive editor of the influential magazine Du Shu from 1996 to 2007. The US magazine Foreign Policy named him as one of the top 100 public intellectuals in the world in May 2008. Wang's research focuses on contemporary Chinese literature and intellectual history. He's the recipient of many awards and has been a visiting professor at Harvard, Edinburgh and Stanford, to name but a few. A representative portion of Wang's work has been translated into English and other languages, including The End of Revolution, China and the Limits of Modernity, China's New Order, Society, Politics and Economy in Transition, China's 20th Century, Revolution, Retreat and the Road to Equality, and China from Empire to Nation-State. Wang Hui has been called the leader of the New Left, although he has cautioned journalists that he prefers not to embrace this label.
Welcome to Dialogue, Professor Wang Hui. A recent editorial by Mr. Martin Wolf for Financial Times suggests clearly that the process of globalization may have reached a turning point and perhaps starts to be in decline. Do you share this opinion?
The atmosphere changed, I think, at least. In the 1990s, there was a period more optimistic. But from the beginning, there was certain kind of the resistance against that type of we call it new liberal globalization. So it's difficult to generally define it as anti-globalization, but anti-certain type of the globalization, I think. Now the atmosphere, more because of the social divide, because of the refugee issues, because all these, the consequences from there. So the atmosphere about the feeling and the atmosphere about the globalization change.
Professor Wang, has globalization created more disparity or income gaps between rich and poor?
Yeah, I think in different countries, for example, as the occupation moment shows in America, that the so-called 99 to the 1%, that the contrast showed that, and also as well as the shrinking of the middle class in those advanced countries, developed countries, that obviously the widening of the poor and the rich.
Let's look at the issue of refugees. Now, the 21st century has started with the greatest global forced displacement in Syria, the civil strife in this war-torn country in the Middle East, with more than 65 million people being left homeless by conflicts and persecution in 2015, according to the UN Refugee Agency. Will things get even worse?
Yes, I think so. But that was not only happened here. Now, you know, this is a sequence of the series of the wars. And the first wave, of course, it's about the collapse of the Eastern European countries. A lot of the migrants moved to the West. But now, after the 90s, a series of wars happened in Africa, Middle East, and other countries. So that was triggered the refugee tide.
Is the strong rebound of populist sentiments a backlash against the dynamics of globalization, Professor Wang?
Obviously, there's a reaction to these continuing widening of the poor and the rich and the social differentiation, as well as certain kind of the religious issues. These are ethnic and religious issues. But the first of all, I think we need to redefine the concept of populism, because how to analyze, first of all, what's kind of the social, political, economic roots for these, rather than simply use this term to blame the moment, because so many different types of the social moments in the world, and so many different types of critique of these type of the globalization. So first of all, we need to redefine the category of the populist, not overuse it.
What are the imminent dangers of deglobalization? And with the rise of ultranationalism in European Union, for example, do you think traditional borders will be closed?
I think it's not easy to answer this question, because the certain kind of the protectionism was it's a kind of the reaction to that type of the globalization. Obviously, nobody likes to close the door, so it's different. So the opening issue is not necessarily equal to support this type of globalization. We need to improve, to change the certain kind of trend. But of course, in order to be better open.
Is Britain's dramatic and unexpected decision to slam door on the 40 years membership of the European Union part of a result of not handling globalization very well?
Yeah, I think so. Because it's not only the singular phenomena. It is, of course, it's a very important phenomenon. But now it seems that there was a trend in many places, especially in the Western countries, for being more protectionist. Actually, you know that China is in a position that has not been fully recognized as a market economy even. So these are one of the aspect of that story, that what kind of the protectionism is also not completely new. But as I said, it's not the completely new story, but the atmosphere changed a lot.
It's been argued that China has been the biggest beneficiary of the dynamic globalization, but how do you foresee the possibility that China will further get integrated with the rest of the world economically?
I think China did benefit from the process for the integration economically, but of course also suffered from too. This is for example, we have become the world factories, but we suffered from ecological crisis. This is only one aspect of the story. So we can talk about the GDP increase, we can talk about the Chinese tourism go abroad and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, for a lot of people in different regions suffered from ecological crisis and the social differentiation, also one of the aspects of that. So it's not simply to talk about the beneficiary or we suffered, but these are double stories, double face of the story.
Trade globalization seems to have stalled, and one can see a steady rise in protectionist measures. Is it inevitable that things will get worse if Donald Trump, the presidential hopeful of the American Republicans, gets elected?
It's difficult to say. I don't know exactly, because you know the recent stories in Asia, and a lot of the intensification of the conflicts, even in the current administration, still ongoing, that process.
Some argue that at a time of a poor economic performance in leading high-income countries, such as OECD countries, rising inequality and big shifts in the balance of global power, global collapse might be a possibility. Thus, it requires a hegemonic power, such as the UK before 1914 and the United States after 1945, to maintain the world order.
I don't think so. I think we need a new order, real new order. Now it's no order, it's actually disorder. And I think that the small countries, especially Global South, have much more space for speaking out. And their voices should be heard in the public arena, in the international public arena.
What better management or global governance is badly needed at this defining moment about the globalization or deglobalization so that we can usher in a bright future?
I think that I think that the One Belt One Road is one of the good policy for that. We need to continue that project, and also we actually work together with different countries, maintain that the One Belt One Road as a multiple participation initiative. I think the projects, it's China's initiative, but as a project, multiple participation is needed.
The son of a Chinese language teacher who emigrated from Taizhou, Wang Gungwu was born in Dutch Indonesia and raised in Malaya. Wang Gungwu has taught at the University of Malaya and at the Australian National University. He was Vice-Chancellor of the University of Hong Kong from 1986 to 1995. In 2007, he became only the third person to be named university professor by the National University of Singapore. Professor Wang has been recognized internationally as one of the world's leading historians on China and Southeast Asia. Perhaps more than anyone else, he has highlighted the complex dilemmas facing overseas Chinese living abroad and their interactions with China. Professor Wang affirms, if you don't have a sense of the past, your future will be diminished. Knowing where you come from, where your roots are, and all those great and terrible things that happened in the past strengthens your identity.
Welcome back to Dialogue, Mr. Wang. In his latest editorial for Financial Times, Mr. Martin Wolf argues that many pieces of evidence in trade and capital flows prove that globalization has reached a point where you can expect to have a U-turn and a sharp decline. What do you think of his concerns?
It sounds like he's exaggerating a little bit, but I think it is a fair warning that some of the inequalities created by globalization has not been attended to. And the speed at which some things are growing have left a lot of people behind. And that gap also leads to misunderstandings and fears, which of course can unsettle people. And in democratic societies, when lots of people are unsettled, it tends to affect the politics, the dynamics of the political system. And that, of course, has consequences which go beyond people's expectations. These are real concerns.
Real concerns indeed. China has been the biggest beneficiary, perhaps, of globalization. If you look at what has taken place since China's entry into the WTO in the year 2001, however, at the same time, China has always been accused by global players such as the United States of outsourcing its jobs, and we also face many strong signs of trade protectionism. Do you think China will find it more difficult to get integrated with the world as negotiations have intensified for multilateral trade regime and to set new rules?
It's hard to predict because I don't think it's a straight line or a simple development. I think all sides, everybody involved, is thinking about it. So they are finding ways of readjusting themselves, their relationships. For example, I don't think, for example, Europe is just sitting there waiting for something to happen. I think they are also rethinking their position in the world, and they are open to further negotiations. And this is where I think it counts a lot, that these negotiations are conducted seriously and with sensitivity, that everybody looks out for opportunities to change and modify bits of the system which are causing some of the inequalities. I think unless you address the question of inequality very soon, then the situation may get really out of control. So I think that's the critical point, is that people are aware, and all the discussions, whether they are protectionist or whether they're more asking for more free trade, all these debates are really feeling their way, in a way like feeling the stones across the river, feeling their way towards a better, a more stable system. I think they are all concerned, but that's a good sign. I'm not too pessimistic about this. I think people are now aware, and they're working very hard to find ways of renegotiating some of the terms of world trade and a globalized system.
Let's take a closer look at who are the victims of globalization. Maybe other than the elites of the military, business, and politicians, it's the working class and the growing army of the middle class that have been pushed to the margins, and their growing grievances about the consequences of globalization are being heeded through media discussions and a lot of debates.
My view is that different parts of the world, different peoples are being affected. For example, in the West, in Western Europe in particular, and United States, it's the middle class that feels most affected by globalization, because they've become rather stagnant in their growth, and they sense that things are not going to get any better for them. They might not even be better for their own next generation and children and so on. So I think the middle class are affected mostly in the West. But in the developed world, you're right. I think the working classes, the people down below, feel very pressured by the fact that globalization is pressing for more automation, more work which is no longer requires the workers in the same way. They feel a little uneasy about that. But I think the rate of development is such that it's not that fast that is affecting the working classes so badly. But the immediate effect on the middle class in the West since 2008, I think, has been quite serious. And that is one of the reasons why it seems to be more turbulent in Western political systems than in Asia. I find that extremely interesting.
Fears and concerns about the consequences of globalization may have been fueled by the rise of populism or on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. The Brexit campaign is one case in point, and the rise of Donald Trump is quite another. Do you think the rise of populism, which covers issues like terrorism, immigration, free movement of labor forces in the EU, and of course immigration will no longer be warmly welcomed by those who support Donald Trump?
Populism seems to me unavoidable in a society that is more open and where communications are so fast, and our technology is moving faster and faster, so that everybody gets to know what's happening all the time. And when people know, or they think they know, or partly know, and they have a voice, then populism is almost inevitable. I can't see that as something that you can prevent. So what we are faced with is a question of how to deal with this populism, something that the elites of the various countries have not had to deal with for some time. And I think they've forgotten how to deal with populism. So on one hand, there's just alarm and concern. On the other hand, they feel like wanting to somehow stop it. But I don't think either way will work, because this populism is not something extraordinary. It actually flows naturally from the progress that we have made in the last few decades. The speed at which that is happening is making the voices of people more easily heard, more quickly heard, and I think the impact of that is going to be considerable everywhere, and nobody's going to be free from that. None of the elites in the world can be free from that.
Is Britain's unexpected decision to slam door on its 40 years membership of the EU part of the result of not handling globalization very well?
Well, I think the British people were rather surprised at the result, like the rest of us. I think most of us did think that the British people won't, when it came to it, actually vote to leave the EU. The consequences to me are so uncertain for not only Britain but for everybody else in the West, that they would have hesitated to do that. So it was a surprise. So I have a feeling that the British people are sort of trying to get used to this idea, and they are feeling their way towards what is the best way to come out of all this with a soft landing and not get hurt too badly. And this is not yet certain, but I suspect that the leaders there are trying their very best to do that, and the people who voted for Brexit are also a little hesitant now as to what is going to happen afterwards. And nobody is certain. And this is a very interesting phase for British history. I think it was a bad mistake that the Prime Minister made, but it is something now they have to live with. And the rest of us have to somehow adapt to that, because that has consequences to all of us.
Despite the populist headlines on resistance to immigration, there are more migrants than ever in history, and the world is entering a period of a demographic dilution. What would be your solution to the refugee problem? An issue that is featured prominently in the Middle East following the military intervention by the US-led alliance there, which also triggered the outburst of the Arab Revolution. The EU is, of course, facing this daunting challenge, and Angela Merkel might suffer heavily in domestic politics.
I think there's no easy solution, and I'm afraid that all the countries involved have to go through a lot of hard searching to see what can be done. The speed at which this whole thing has developed and the numbers involved are unprecedented, and I think nobody knows, there's no simple answer. And the wisdom of leaders would be really tested on this one. And I don't actually see many wise leaders coping with this very well in Europe. But Angela Merkel, I think, was very bold in making her decision. But as you rightly say, she might have to pay for that. But if that happens, it will be even more misery for the European countries. So I do hope that Merkel's voice will be heard in some quarters and some moderation will occur. But the speed at which this is happening, and the numbers are quite frightening to the ordinary people. I can understand.
Well, Germany has been the engine of the European economic recovery. Given the strong reluctance in Germany, there is no such thing like consensus to be shared by European leaders about the issue of refugees, and particularly following the lone wolf terrorist attacks. Don't you think the traditional borders are likely to be closed between and among member states of the European Union? And that would be a serious blow to the dynamics of globalization.
This could happen, and you're quite right. It would do a lot of damage to globalization. But if it happens, it will not be because of some large global worldview. It will be because of the local interest of each of the countries involved. I think you can't prevent that. You have different countries, over 20 countries in the EU. Each one of them will have their own interest in mind. Their leaders are very concerned by just seeing what happened to Merkel in the last elections, local elections. I think would remind all their leaders to be extremely cautious, and that could lead to each of the countries taking the decision entirely on the basis of their own national interests. And that, I think, the consequences of that are going to be very widespread, and will affect everybody too.
Some argue that at a time of a poor economic performance in leading high-income countries, rising inequality and big shifts in the balance of a global power, global collapse might be a possibility. Thus, it requires a hegemonic power, such as the UK before 1914 and the US after 1945, the end of the Second World War.
Well, during those periods, those hegemonic powers were indisputably hegemonic in ways which are not, I think, present today. I think the US hegemony has been battered by their mistakes in the Middle East, and today their credibility, particularly the economic credibility, is not as strong as it was in 1945 or the 1950s and 60s. So I think it will have a harder time to be persuasive to other people, to listen to them. And so the danger is that each region, each major economy will start to take decisions entirely on their own terms and not consider the consequences to others. That would be the worst possible result. But my own feeling, I'm still fairly optimistic that the leaders will recognize that that is a bad road to take. They must avoid that at all costs and negotiate and find ways and means to compromise, to be moderating the most damaging and dangerous aspects of this present trend. I think that is more likely. I don't see people just giving up and letting the national interests alone take over, because I think they recognize the long-term impact of that will be dangerous to everybody, including themselves.
Let me go back to an early question about the free movement of labor as well as terrorist attacks. Following the possibility of closing borders, do you think there will be the rise of ultra-nationalist sentiments and far-right movement? Because politicians got to listen to their electorate, and they have to be more conservative and cautious in terms of integration with other economies on the periphery.
To me, that two questions are so closely related that one cannot be without the other. I mean, if they make a decision to close their borders, that already shows that the ultra-nationalists are winning, and that, I think, is a bad sign. So I do hope that the Europeans are able to find the way out of that particular final decision. That would be, to me, the most negative of all decisions. But how to moderate that? I mean, they're trying very hard. I mean, their negotiations with Turkey is an example of how they try to at least keep the numbers under control. But these numbers are getting very complicated because they're not only numbers from the Middle East, but the continued numbers of people coming from Africa. I mean, the Mediterranean now is just a sea full of little boats of refugees, and they're coming from all directions. And I can imagine why some of the Europeans are getting so nervous that they're losing their sense of balance on what to do. But I do feel there are enough people doing the warnings and working very hard to find solutions, will somehow find something in time. But I'm just still optimistic that this is possible.
Trade globalization has somehow stagnated, and one can see a steady rise in protectionist measures. Is it inevitable that things will get worse if Donald Trump, who has embraced protectionism and denigrated global institutions, were to be elected president in November?
You know, we have great difficulty in reading Donald Trump. I honestly do not know what he will do or say next, because he has been so, he's been changing his mind and saying all sorts of outrageous things every now and then. And we're not at all clear what he will actually do. That is the most frightening thing about Mr. Trump's election, would be that we do not know what he's going to do. Not because of what he's actually said so far, because he's always accompanied what he said with something else which contradicts it, and he doesn't seem to be too concerned about being consistent and being thoroughly clear about what he wants to do. So I think the dangers there are really real because we are uncertain, unsure what he will do. If I were clearer, I would at least know either yes or no to Mr. Trump. But at the moment, it has to be no, because we just don't know what he's thinking about and what he will do.
Let's move from U.S. domestic elections to the issue of globalization. Do you think, here, if you are facing three options, globalization or gathering momentum of globalization, deglobalization and reglobalization, which one would be your preference?
I think globalization as a general trend in world history is inevitable. That will continue.
It's irreversible.
Irreversible. So the wise thing to do is to find new ways and means of looking at the potential consequences of what the present set of circumstances will lead to. How would it affect the overall globalizing forces of the world? And that requires a lot of rethinking. And I think this is being done.
Rethinking about rewriting the rules, for example.
It could be that. It could mean a whole range of things. Rewriting the rules.
Reconfiguration.
Yes, and institutions that need to be readjusted, and some of the institutions do need to be updated because things have changed from what they were like in the 1940s and 50s. So all that, I think, has to be taken into account. There was a certain smugness about how well things were going in the last few decades, and so people were so confident that globalization would be, overcome everything and solve all problems. But now that we know that it can't, then people must be working very hard, and they are, to see whether they can be adjusted. But because it is irreversible, in my view, all the things will be ultimately would shape a new kind of globalization, something that with more chances of survival, something that we're more likely to have positive results. That is the kind of progress that human beings have been known for the last 100 years or so. I suspect there's still enough wisdom left to push in that direction. But time is running out. There is a sense of urgency. And leaders, I think, are quite anxious to find a way out. But they mustn't be too impatient, because I think this cannot be too quickly done. You need a lot of careful calculations about what things should look like. But the key point is, to my mind, is that globalization is irreversible.
Irreversible, perhaps with the help of G20 instead of G7. Thank you very much, Professor Wang.
You're welcome.
I do appreciate it. Thank you.